A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 25. These are the descendants of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, and the sister of Laban the Aramean, from Padan Aram. Isaac pleaded with the Holy One for his wife, since she was infertile. The Holy One was moved by his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. But the children were crushing each other inside of her, and she said, "If this is what it's like, why must it happen to me?" So she went to inquire of the Holy One. And the Holy One said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from your body shall be divided. One people shall be stronger than the other people, and the older shall serve the younger." When her days of pregnancy were up, look, there were twins in her womb. Out came the first one, red all over like a cloak of hair. So they named him Esau, hairy. Immediately afterward came his brother. His hand was gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, the heel grabber. Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. The boys grew up. Esau became a man skilled in hunting, a man of the field, while Jacob became a mild man who kept to the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his hunting, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was boiling up a stew, Esau came in from the field famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Feed me, please, with some of that red stuff, for I am famished." That is why he was called the name Edom. But Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright this very day." Esau said, "Look, I am about to die, so what is my birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me this very day." So he swore it. He sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate, drank, got up, and went on his way. Thus Esau treated his birthright as worthless. A word from God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I know that I'm not the only one who has watched the recording of Hamilton that came out last week. I have been a fan and a critic of this musical for several years now, so I was thrilled to get to sit down on the couch with my wife and let the music and songs sweep me up, songs that I practically have memorized at this point. Lin-Manuel Miranda says of his musical that it is the story of America then, told by America now. It's the story of historical underdogs, the orphan immigrant Alexander Hamilton, and a cluster of colonies standing up against an empire, told by today's underdogs, talented actors of color who often find themselves passed over in favor of their white counterparts. But now they take leading roles as the United States founders, rebels, revolutionaries. And the genres of rap and hip hop created by Black and Latina communities and therefore belittled by white America are proven to be music of true merit. And that is super cool. And yet, there is rightful criticism to be made about this musical. Some argue that it is no triumph for the stories of white, slave-holding founding fathers to be elevated once again, no matter who is playing them. Indeed, the lower-class immigrant Alexander Hamilton works non-stop in his quest to achieve the status and wealth of the colony's patriarchs. His is a struggle to assimilate into the established power paradigm. And while throughout the show Alexander makes frequent jabs at the hypocrisy of these men who claim that all are created equal while owning human beings, he never actually does much to upend this status quo. One article praising Hamilton describes the musical as deliberately injecting people of color into positions of official and institutional power that have long been defined as the dominion of white men. And that's cool and all, but is the goal of anti racist and feminist work really to inject marginalized persons into the current power structure? To empower some of them to wield the same weapons of violence and control that white men have wielded, rather than destroying those weapons altogether? This is where the Genesis story comes in for me, because I've always rooted for Jacob as an underdog. And I see in him, as in so many of the patriarchs of Genesis, the same kind of paradox that is present in America's founding fathers. Carrie Connolly expresses this idea in her book, Good White Racist, saying, "We have these founding fathers, dysfunctional slave owning bastards who were at the same time deep thinkers, who were radically dedicated to human uplift, mostly for white people. How can these men, whom some of us love to love and others of us love to hate, be both inspirational and atrocious at the same exact time? Likewise, how can Jacob, whom some praise as a clever, hard-working underdog, and others see solely as a cruel and conniving trickster, be both inspirational and atrocious at the same exact time?" Like Alexander Hamilton, Jacob struggles nonstop, even from the womb, to secure his place in a world that casts a second born son like him into the role of obedient servant to his older brother's whims. Throw in the fact that Jacob is effeminate, preferring to hang out with women cooking in the tent while his manly man of a twin goes out hunting, and you've got a figure who is destined for very little power in his world. As a queer person, and as someone who believes that God has a special care for those whom the world marginalizes, I can't help but cheer for Jacob, even when he resorts to trickery to get a leg up. And yet, is the kind of power that Jacob will go to any length to secure, including betraying his own brother and deceiving family members, really a power to celebrate? Now that you know where I am headed, reflecting on Jacob's grand future as a head of his own household, a man rich in livestock and women and slaves, let's zoom backwards to that day at the cook fire, where one tired, hungry brother asks the other for some soup. Poor, stupid Esau. That's how most of us are taught to imagine him, right? Silly, foolish, pitiful Esau, who cared more for the instant gratification of filling his rumbling stomach than for his birthright, the power and wealth that was his right due to the mere circumstances of his birth. The kinder among us feel some sympathy for Esau. After all, his twin brother takes advantage of his hunger, exploits it to get what he wants from Esau. And I want to honor that response because it is good and human to feel sympathy for anyone who experiences hunger and loss. And we should feel uncomfortable with Jacob's cruelty in this story. But at the same time, I'm going to take us down a different route today, one that offers a different reading of Esau than that of an impulsive fool or a swindled victim. Instead, I am going to focus on Jacob's and Esau's roles within a system that is so much bigger than their individual struggle. Much like the stories told in Hamilton, the family stories of Genesis are larger than life. They are about individuals, but they are also about whole nations. After all, God tells Rebekah not that there are two babies battling in her womb, but two nations, two peoples. So for today, let's focus on that broader aspect of Esau's story. Let's read his motives as those of a man who was assigned patriarch at birth. "Give me some of that red stuff," Esau commands, as a man who is not used to being denied anything. "Sell me your birthright," Jacob retorts. Esau agrees to this trade, but I do not believe that he ever intended to make good on his word. He would have the soup and keep his birthright. Because how on earth is little Jacob ever going to force Esau to uphold his end of the bargain? His confidence in the status quo is what allows Esau to hand over his birthright so casually, because he knows that merely saying it's Jacob's now does not make it so. Their world of patriarchy guaranteed Esau his inheritance, whether he was a good man or bad, an honest man or a liar. He could tell his younger brother whatever Jacob wanted to hear, but down the road he could trust that his father would give the blessing and the birthright to Esau anyway. In The Soul of the Stranger, reading God and Torah from a transgender perspective, Jewish scholar Joy Layden says, "Though Jacob is born holding on to his brother's heel, he is considered the second-born, expected to accept the authority of his older brother, who, after their father's death, will be the head of the family." Like the gender binary, this law of inheritance, called primogeniture, creates a lifelong, life-determining binary division between males who are and those who are not firstborn sons. And like the gender binary, primogeniture turns biology, in this case birth order, into destiny. The way male children are raised, the roles they are assigned, and the futures towards which they are steered are determined by whether they are or are not firstborn sons. End quote. Esau has grown up understanding that his inheritance is his destiny. It's what he's been born for, what he's been raised for, what he is entitled to. Why would he believe that he would ever have to make good on his silly promise to Jacob to hand over that destiny? It is set in stone. It is inviolable. At least, it is in the eyes of men, but not to God. It is clear that God is not so committed to the various roles that people are assigned from birth. As God tells Rebekah while she laments the violence of her pregnancy, God intends for her younger son to usurp the elder, turning the system of primogeniture on its head. In the ancient past and in the present day, countless roles get assigned to us as soon as or even before we exit the womb. Biology is presumed destiny in so many ways. Our gender, our race, our class and geopolitical position, the family we are born into, supposedly map out what our personalities will be, how our lives will go. And certainly these things do shape us, both by nature and nurture. Generational traumas come packed into our very selves, while our assigned roles shape how others treat us and how we see the world. And the thing about this system is that it is really, really hard for anybody to be a good person while trapped within it. Whether we are on the privileged side, like Esau, whose privilege makes him arrogant and entitled and, we will see in a moment, violent, or on the oppressed side, like Jacob, whose only chance at advancement requires him to take advantage of family members, to use lies and deceit. It doesn't really matter how good we are at heart. The patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist systems in which we find ourselves compel us all towards the worst versions of ourselves. But even so, biology is not destiny. Our assigned roles are not destiny, especially not if God has anything to say about it. For God is the great binary breaker, no respecter of persons or prejudices. Indeed, God almost seems to delight in upending our assumptions about who is blessed. Second-born sons and eunuchs, women and disabled persons, impoverished persons, and disenfranchised people. These are the ones whom God selects again and again to be both recipients and agents of God's divine blessing here on earth. and thus Jacob ends up receiving his father's blessing after all, though he has to employ deception to do so. But Jacob cannot stick around to claim the wealth and status that comes with that blessing, for his brother Esau is enraged, murderously so, and Jacob flees. Esau had every reason to believe that his biology determined his destiny, that because of the privilege he did nothing to earn, he could make an impulsive promise, make a big mistake, and everything would still turn out in his favor. He was born into a world that told him so every day, that even told him that God sanctioned these human assumptions and systems. But God does not. God blesses us when we can imagine beyond the narrative we are taught, as Jacob does in this story, and, incredibly, as Esau eventually does. In Genesis 33, Esau catches up to the runaway Jacob after decades apart, and Jacob expects violence. Overwhelmed with fear, Jacob sends gifts to Esau, hoping to quell some of his anger. But to Jacob's shock, Esau is no longer murderously angry at having lost what he grew up assuming he was entitled to. Esau rushes to his brother, throws his arms around Jacob's neck, and weeps. Esau was raised believing he would own everything and his brother nothing, that Jacob would be one of many members of Esau's household subservient to him. But now he does not even feel entitled to the livestock that Jacob offers him. He says, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what's yours." Somehow, at some point in Esau's journey, he has learned to imagine bigger than the myths of scarcity and supremacy into which he was born. He has learned to imagine a world where siblings can thrive side by side, where there is plenty for all of them. But, as I said at the start of this sermon, this story is far from perfect. Even before Esau does, Jacob was able to imagine bigger for himself, to escape the marginalized destiny assigned to him, but he does not imagine big enough. He does not use his new station to liberate others, and I believe that's because the idea simply never occurs to him. The only dream his world has given him is one where he has the same kind of power that once oppressed him. The kind of power that compels a good person to exploit others, to push others down in order to advance oneself. Jacob, the second born, becomes Jacob the patriarch. His household will be fraught with all of the woes that come with this system that stifles everyone inside it. His wives will hate each other and battle for every bit of power they can claim. His sons will do the same, subjecting the younger Joseph to violence when, like Jacob, this little sibling dares to dream of something greater than the role he is assigned. What if Jacob could have imagined bigger? What if he had used his one fragment of clarity about how patriarchy stifled his true self to empower others too? Well, the imagination something like that takes is actually a lot harder than it might sound. How could Jacob imagine a world that doesn't pit siblings against siblings, or those who hoard resources against those forced to do their bidding? He had never seen such a world, and neither have we. Carrie Connolly argues in Good White Racist that this difficulty of imagination is a big part of why we settle for unjust systems, even if they slowly but surely strip us of our humanity. Why we argue for smaller fixes and reforms instead of the huge overhaul that is actually needed. She writes, "We are ashamed of our failure of imagination when it comes to healing ourselves and our country's racial problems, so we prefer to pretend everything's fine." We are ashamed of our failure of imagination. We cannot imagine a world without police and prisons, so we buckle down on our insistence that they just have to exist, that the systems can be fixed, That those who argue for prison and police abolition just don't know what they're talking about, even if they've been researching the issue for decades. We cannot imagine a world where there is no hierarchy of rich and poor, a world where everyone has enough. So we all just do what we can to keep ourselves afloat in the uncaring waves of capitalism and class. We cannot imagine. But what if we could? What new and beautiful world could we build? My friends, we can and we must cultivate imagination. Help bring detail and definition to these vague dreams of a perfect world by seeking inspiration from activists like Angela Davis, who offers concrete alternatives to prison and police, capitalism and cis-hetero patriarchy. And when our imaginations are brought alive, we can strive against the systems that force evil deeds on good people. We can dare to dream bigger than Jacob, bigger than America's founders as depicted in Hamilton. We can design a world that rejects the dog eat dog, zero sum game in which everyone loses in favor of equity and partnership. As we feed our imaginations to fuel the fight for freedom for all peoples, we will catch ever clearer glimpses of that kingdom into which Jesus invites us. That kingdom without a tyrant king. That kingdom of peace that is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. I can hardly imagine it. Can you? But let us keep working to expand our imaginations, expand our knowledge and our ties of solidarity until we truly can envision God's abundant life, not just for some far off by and by, but right here, right now on earth.